We begin my top 36 remaining running back rankings. Remember that players who played on Thursday night or if they're on bye are not included in these rankings. So if you notice somebody missing that fits under that criteria, that's why. We have running backs that I think are probably mid to low end RB3s. We have Jaleel McLaughlin, Tyler Algier, Cam Akers, Ray Davis, Tyjae Spears, Jalen Warren, Raheem Mostert, and Travis Etienne. Jaleel McLaughlin is playing against Kansas City. They are the worst at giving away points to the running back position in the sense of a difficult matchup. I do think, though, that with Kansas City probably winning this game, they're going to have to get some passing game utilization out of the running backs. And so I do think he sees a couple of grabs and some additional work this game specifically. I just don't think he has a ton of high upside given the difficulty in the matchup. Then we have Tyler Algier against New Orleans. New Orleans just traded away their cornerback Marshawn Lattimore, which in and of itself doesn't particularly impact the run game specifically, but it just makes their defense worse altogether. And I really think that the Falcons are going to be winning this game substantially. And so I do think that Tyler Algier gets some additional work, and I do think he scores a touchdown in this one. Then we have Cam Akers against Jacksonville. I think that he's going to see a good amount of usage in this game, considering Jacksonville probably isn't going to have T-Law. And so I think that both running backs are very strong starts, at least from Cam Akers' perspective, a strong start compared to where you would normally slot him in lineups. And so I do think he's a decent flex option this week. Then we have Ray Davis against Indianapolis. Ray Davis in 2 of the past 3 games has had a pretty solid game. I think that they're probably going to be beating Indianapolis heavily. Indianapolis is 22nd in running back scoring, so it's an advantageous matchup as well. And so I do think he sees a good amount of work in this one. Then we have Tyjae Spears against the Chargers. It's a really tough matchup. I do think he sees quite a few receptions in this game, though. I think the Titans are going to be losing, especially considering Will Levis is going to be quarterbacking them. And so I do think that he's a high floor option this week, but probably a limited ceiling given the matchup. Then we have Jalen Warren against the Washington Commanders. It's a middle-of-the-road matchup. He's looked pretty good, though, in his return from injury. I think he sees a couple grabs. I think Washington's probably going to be winning this game, and I think he's going to be relatively efficient on the ground. Then we have Raheem Mostert against the Los Angeles Rams. I think he's going to get his normal usage. I do think he scores a touchdown, which saves his day. I just don't think that he has a ton of upside unless he has a multi-touchdown game in this one. Then we have Travis Etienne against Minnesota. I think they're going to be losing handily. I do think he sees a little bit more usage than he saw this past week in his second week back from injury. I just don't think with the emergence of Tank Bigsby that he's a particularly high upside play this week, given the probable game script of them losing without Trevor Lawrence playing. And so for that reason, I think he's just a mid RB3. And now we have running backs that I think are probably high-end RB3s to potentially low-end RB2s. We have Bucky Irving, Jordan Mason, Austin Eckler, Javonte Williams, Rashad White, Najee Harris, and Tony Pollard. Bucky Irving is playing against San Fran this week. I think San Fran's probably going to be winning this game, but I do think it's going to be a particularly high-scoring outing for both teams. And I think he sees quite a bit of pass game utilization, given that Mike Evans is still out and Godwin's out for the year. Jordan Mason is playing against Tampa Bay this week. I think that he's going to get some utilization. I know the 49ers in general use a featured back. I do think, though, that in McCaffrey's first game back, they're probably not going to try to run him immediately into the ground. I could be wrong, but I do think Mason sees a solid amount of touches in what should be a pretty high-scoring game, and I think he's going to be pretty efficient with his touches as well. Then we have Austin Eckler against Pittsburgh. It's a really tough matchup. They are the 7th best in terms of running back scoring prevention. With the likelihood of Robinson being out, though, I do think he sees some additional usage. I just don't think he's going to be particularly efficient in this game, but I think he's a pretty high floor option given that he should receive a substantial amount of receiving work. Then we have Javonte Williams against Kansas City. I do think that he's the preferred play out of the Denver backfield. It is the toughest matchup you can draw, so for that reason, I don't think he has a ton of upside, but I do think he's going to see quite a bit of work in the passing game, just like with McLaughlin. Then we have Rashad White against San Fran. I think that he's going to perform similarly to Bucky Irving. I think he's going to get more utilization in the passing game in particular, but I think they're both high floor options. I just think they're going to kind of curb each other's ceiling. I also don't project a touchdown, but if he does have one, he's going to finish a lot higher. Then we have Najee Harris against Washington. I think that he's going to be relatively efficient. I think he's going to see a substantial amount of passing game utilization as well. I do think Pittsburgh's probably losing this game, but I think he's going to be relatively efficient and have a pretty safe floor in this one. Then we have Tony Pollard against the Chargers. With Tyjae Spears coming back, I do think that limits his upside. It's also a really tough matchup, but he's been pretty good on the ground, and he's been seeing quite a bit of passing game utilization. So I think he's a pretty high floor option. I just don't think he's a really high ceiling option in what's a really tough matchup against the Chargers. If you like what you're hearing and seeing so far, feel free to like and subscribe. It's a free and easy way to support the channel, and I'd really appreciate it. Make sure you check out my quarterback, wide receiver, and tight end rankings as well as they come out. Quarterbacks and tight ends are already out, and my wide receiver rankings are coming out later today as well. So if you like what you've seen and heard, just like and subscribe. Thanks. Now we have running backs that I think are probably mid to high-end RB2s this week. We have James Conner, Rico Dowdle, J.K. Dobbins, Ramondre Stevenson, David Montgomery, Chuba Hubbard, James Cook, and Jahmyr Gibbs. James Conner is playing against the Jets this week. He's been a little bit less efficient recently. They haven't been tremendous matchups, but we've also seen that Trey Benson and Amari DeMarcado have played particularly well and do appear, particularly Benson, to be receiving a little bit more usage recently. And so for that reason, I do think that with the potential for a limited upside in terms of total touches, although he's still getting a good amount of usage, in what's also a tough matchup against the Jets, that we're not going to see some of the really high upside that we would a lot of times see in more advantageous matchups from James Conner this week. Then we have Rico Dowdle playing against Philadelphia this week. It's a really tough matchup. They don't have Dak. I think he's going to see an increased usage in the passing game, but I think he's going to be particularly inefficient on the ground. But I do think he's a high floor option given that they're likely to be losing this game. And with a backup quarterback coming in, a lot of times they're not just comfortable enough to just run the normal offense. Sometimes they might have limitations. Cooper Rush hasn't ever been particularly amazing, but he's definitely performed better than some backup quarterbacks that I can remember. So I do think that once again, the offense is a little bit more limited, but I don't think it's going to be so ineffective that they can't get anything going the entire game. And so I think Rico Dowdle has his floor relatively raised this week, but the ceiling capped as well. Then we have J.K. Dobbins against the Titans. It's a really tough matchup, but he was really good in a tough matchup this past week. I don't project him to have a massive game. I do think he scores a touchdown, though. And so I think he's a solid RB2, but I don't think he has RB1 upside this week. Then we have Ramondre Stevenson against the Chicago Bears. He's been on a tear recently. Chicago's defense is really, really tough, though. I really think they're going to make life very difficult for Drake May and this offense. And so I think he's going to be receiving a decent amount of passing game utilization, but I don't think he's going to find a ton of room on the ground. Then we have David Montgomery against Houston. It is a really tough matchup, the 6th worst in fantasy football, but they're the Lions offense. I think he scores a touchdown and has a pretty solid day overall. Then we have Chuba Hubbard against the Giants. I don't think that Jonathan Brooks ends up playing in this game, and so I have Chuba Hubbard here. I think he's going to get a touchdown in this game. I don't think he's going to have a tremendous day. I don't think the Panthers offense in general is, but I do think he's a high floor option, assuming he gets all of the touches out of the backfield with Jonathan Brooks not playing in this game. Then we have James Cook against the Indianapolis Colts. I think he's a pretty high upside play. I do think that Ray Davis gets some utilization as well. I do think they're going to handily beat the Colts, but I think he's quite efficient, and I do think he scores a touchdown in this game. Then we have Jahmyr Gibbs against Houston. I think he, just like David Montgomery, scores a touchdown. I think he sees some passing game utilization. I do think that they're going to be beating the Texans, and so I think they're going to try to salt the game away with Gibbs and Montgomery. And so I do think he's a really high upside play, even though it is a really, really tough matchup this week. Now we have running backs that I think are high-end RB2s to low-end RB1s. We have Kareem Hunt, Christian McCaffrey, Jonathan Taylor, and Aaron Jones. Kareem Hunt is playing against Denver. Against the Buccaneers this past week, he was horrible in the first half, but then took over the game in the second half. Against Denver, I think he's going to find some rushing room. I think he's still going to see basically the entirety of the touches on the ground. I think they're going to be beating Denver, and so I think he gets a ton of volume and is a really high upside play this week. Then we have Christian McCaffrey against Tampa Bay. This is probably the lowest I'll have him ranked rest of season, assuming he's healthy and looks good. It is a really good matchup against Tampa Bay. They are one of the worst defenses. However, I don't think he sees full workhorse utilization in this game, the first game back from injury. I could be wrong, and if I am wrong about that, then he's going to vault up the rankings tremendously, assuming he looks good. I think he's a really high upside play. I would just, it's really tough to know exactly what his utilization is going to look like. So this is just with him receiving about 60 to 70% of the touches. That's what this projection is. If he receives more, I think he has more upside. If he receives less, I don't think he's going to quite get here, but 60 to 70% of the touches. Then we have Jonathan Taylor against the Buffalo Bills. They are the second worst defense, the second best to play against in fantasy. I think he's going to go off in this game. I think he has a ton of upside. I do think due to a lack of receiving game utilization that he's not going to have a ridiculous game in this one, but I think he scores a touchdown and is a really good play overall. Then we have Aaron Jones against Jacksonville. They are the third best defense to go against. I think he's going to go off against Jacksonville. And I do think him and Cam Akers are going to receive a ton of volume in this one. I think they're going to blow out the Jags without Lawrence playing. And so I think he's a really high upside play, and I do think he scores a touchdown. And now we have running backs that I think are going to be RB1s for sure and do have the upside to be the RB1 overall this week. This tier is a little bit larger than it's going to be most weeks, but it's I think it's really tough with this group. We have Breece Hall, Joe Mixon, DeAndre Swift, Tyrone Tracy, Devon Achane, Alvin Kamara, Bijan Robinson, Kyren Williams, and Saquon Barkley. Breece Hall, as of recently, has had some struggles. Arizona is a matchup that's a get-right matchup. I still think he's one of the most, if not potentially the most talented running back in the game. The offensive line isn't particularly great. The scheme isn't either. But better days are ahead for him, and I think he has a pretty solid game in this one with a bunch of passing game utilization. Then we have Joe Mixon against Detroit. I really do think that in this Texans offense, he's matchup proof. He's basically a threat to score 20 points every single week, regardless of matchup. And so I think he's a really strong play again. And if he was in a more advantageous matchup, he'd be closer to number one, if not number one. Then we have DeAndre Swift against the Patriots. They're one of the worst defenses against running backs in the NFL. He's been on a tear after the beginning of the season in which he started off slow. I don't think anything changes. I think he has a really strong game and has a ton of work in the passing game. Then we have Tyrone Tracy playing against the Carolina Panthers. Make no mistake, he has legitimate RB1 overall upside in this week. Their defense is historically bad all around. I think he's going to receive work in the passing game. I think he gets well over 100 rushing yards and does score a touchdown, making him a very high upside play. Then we have Devon Achane against the Rams. It isn't a particularly good matchup, but with Tua playing, Devon Achane is an elite RB1 basically every week. He scored at least 20 points in every game that Tua has played. I don't think that changes once again, and I think he's a really high upside play. And in this matchup against the Rams, there is the potential for a ton of point scoring, so this could be one of his better games. I'm just not going to project 30-plus points really for any running back. I think that's being a little bit too generous in general, but he could easily have a 30-point game in this one. Then we have Alvin Kamara against the Falcons. With basically the entirety of the receiving core injured, I think he receives a ton of usage in this one. I think Taysom Hill is a good play as well. And I think he's going to have a ton of ceiling and floor in this game. I think he's going to receive a ton of pass game utilization. And it would really shock me if he finishes the game with less than 25 total touches. Then we have Bijan against the Saints. He's been a 20-point PPR machine recently. I don't think that changes. The Saints defense is atrocious. Just like I said with Algier, they did lose Lattimore, which you wouldn't think necessarily particularly impacts their run defense, but it just makes their defense worse overall. And so I think the Falcons are going to have their way with the Saints in this one, making Bijan a really strong high RB1 in play this week. Then we have Kyren against the Dolphins. Their run defense isn't very good. Kyren hasn't been particularly efficient recently. I think that changes in this advantageous matchup. I do think that he scores a touchdown this week. Last week was a fluke. It was literally the first time he hasn't scored a touchdown this year. And so I don't think that happens again. And I think he is a very strong high upside play and is my number 2 this week. And then we have Saquon Barkley against Dallas. I think they're going to get a ton of usage out of him this one. I think he's going to be very efficient. I do think he scores 2 touchdowns in this game. I don't think he's really going to be needed in the passing game very much. And so I think he's a really high upside play that is going to absolutely smash and is my RB1. And so to conclude things, running backs I think are probably mid to low end RB3s. We have McLaughlin, Algier, Akers, Davis, Spears, Warren, Mostert, and ETN. Running backs that I think are probably high end RB3s to potentially low end RB2s. We have Bucky Irving, Jordan Mason, Eckler, Williams, White, Harris, and Pollard. Running backs that I think are probably mid RB2s to potentially high end RB2s. We have Connor, Dowdle, Dobbins, Stevenson, Montgomery, Hubbard, Cook, and Jahmyr Gibbs. Running backs that I think are probably high end RB2s to low end RB1s, but probably aren't threats to be the RB1 overall this week. We have Kareem Hunt, Christian McCaffrey, JT, and Aaron Jones. Remember with McCaffrey that this is with him probably not being quite a featured back. If he receives the full workhorse role, I think he's going to finish a lot higher and move Mason way down in these rankings. And then finally, running backs that I think are solid RB1s with absolute RB1 overall upside this week. We have Breece Hall, Joe Mixon, DeAndre Swift, Tyrone Tracy, Devon Achane, Alvin Kamara, Bijan Robinson, Kyren Williams, and Saquon Barkley. All right, so you know the drill. Who do I have too high? Who do I have too low? Is there somebody that I don't have projected for enough points? Let me know below in the comment section and let me know why. With that being said, if you like what you've seen and heard, make sure you like and subscribe, and make sure you check out my quarterback, wide receiver, and tight end rankings as well as they come out. Quarterbacks and tight ends came out yesterday, and wide receivers are coming out with the running back rankings today as well. So yeah, if you like what you've seen and heard, just like and subscribe. Thanks.